Welcome to FO Talks. I am Laura Pavon, and today we are joined by Dr. William LeoGrande, Professor of Government and Dean Emeritus at American University. Beyond his academic work, Dr. LeoGrande has been a key advisor to government and private agencies, as well as a frequent witness before the US Congress and on Latin American foreign policy. He is the author of several books, including Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, and he has published numerous research articles. Overall, he's a widely trusted expert on US-Cuba relations. Thank you for being here, William. We are very happy to have you.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
I would like to start by saying you have dedicated much of your career to analyzing the history of US-Cuba relations, particularly the controversial embargo. And I wanted to take us back in time a little bit, and I'd like to start by revisiting an article that I found you published back in 2015, titled "A Policy Long Past Its Expiration Date," where you discussed the historic shift in US policy under the Obama administration. And that era brought changes to the travel ban, the reestablishment of embassies, and the removal of Cuba from the official list of state sponsors of terrorism, and that designation was later reinstated twice, I believe. And in this article, what I found particularly interesting is that before Donald Trump's first term, you warned against the potential negative consequences that a Republican victory could have on relations between the two countries. So today, as we witness an escalation of imperialistic rhetoric and practices reminiscent of the previous century, how would you describe the trajectory of this relationship from 10 years ago until now? And how does the current moment compare to when Obama first deemed the sanctions outdated?
Well, the situation today in the bilateral relationship is probably as bad as it has ever been. The embargo today, the traditional embargo, which President Kennedy imposed back in 1962, is very tight because the Trump administration has tightened it up tremendously. But on top of that, of course, you have the oil embargo that the president declared back at the end of January, where he threatened other countries with U.S. economic sanctions if they shipped oil to Cuba. And since that time, countries that had been supplying Cuba, Mexico, Algeria, Angola, have stopped. And only Russia has been willing to take the risk of defying and sending oil. And it's not enough. It's not enough oil to replace what the Cubans have lost from the United States stopping Venezuela's oil shipments first, and then intimidating these other countries to prevent them from sending oil to Cuba. So the contrast with Obama's policy could not be more sharp. Obama believed that the United States and Cuba could have peaceful coexistence, in effect, that we could get along, we could deepen our cooperation on issues of mutual interest. We signed 22 bilateral agreements in the last 2 years of the Obama administration on issues of mutual interest. And Obama believed that gradually this would lead to political and economic opening in Cuba. The Trump administration's approach is exactly the opposite. It is to essentially strangle the Cuban economy until the Cuban government surrenders to U.S. terms and accepts the idea of regime change.
Definitely, there's this sense of estranglement, and I want us to in a bit go back to this to the issue of oil shortage. But first, I wanted to frame what's happening right now, starting with last month. Although things could have, like, the escalation of the crisis or the economic crisis has definitely been triggered by the capture of Maduro in Venezuela, and then the subsequent I wasn't considering the intimidation of countries like Mexico, Algeria, and Angola. Like, I was thinking of Venezuela as the main provider, but it's very interesting to see that this also included other number of countries in the intimidation. So when we were watching the outbreak of war with Iran, and this rhetoric started to escalate in relation to Cuba, and President Trump said literally that it would be an honor to take Cuba. And what you were saying about the idea of regime change, I wonder if that's actually the focus of the demands, because of course we have the history of during the Cold War and how the demand was to abandon the socialist system. But what are the actual demands now, if they are actually formulated in a clear way? Because when, for example, with Nicolás Maduro, with the case of Venezuela, we saw that there was a utilization of the anti-war rhetoric as well. So I'm wondering if there is like a sort of mega mix between the association of these countries with drugs, terrorism, and then socialism, and as part of this broader strategy to delegitimize the regime beyond the idea of trying to take over the regime, because we have seen it with Venezuela, like Delcy Rodriguez is still there. So.
Well, she is, and it's interesting because, of course, the administration's stated goal in Venezuela was regime change, and yet they were very happy to settle for simply removing President Maduro and his wife, and now seem to have a very happy working relationship with President Delcy Rodriguez, even though the basic structure of the Chavista regime hasn't changed at all from what we can see from abroad. So it seems pretty clear that what President Trump was interested in the case of Venezuela was reopening the Venezuelan oil sector to U.S. oil companies, because that's pretty much all he's talked about with regard to Venezuela ever since President Maduro was abducted. Now, is Cuba an analogous case? In other words, is the interest in Cuba primarily to open the Cuban economy to U.S. investors and to U.S. trade once again, and try to turn the clock back to the 1950s when the United States was the dominant economic force in Cuba? I think that's a possibility. Certainly, what we have heard in reports from the press about the U.S. agenda in the talks that are currently underway with Cuba, most of the issues are economically focused. It's about Cuba taking care of the property claims of U.S. citizens who lost property after the revolution. It's about opening Cuba up to foreign direct investment more, the Cuban private sector, and getting into the Cuban strategic minerals sector of the economy. So now I should add, of course, that Secretary of State Marco Rubio. I should add that Secretary of State Marco Rubio has talked about the need for political change on the island, and And he said this a couple of times. He said, well, the economy doesn't work, and it's because the people in charge don't know how to run an economy, so we have to change the people in charge. That's a red line for the Cubans. They've been very clear that while they're open to a dialogue, particularly around economic issues, bilateral economic issues, they're not going to allow the United States to dictate to them the shape of their political system or who their political leaders are. I mean, they see that as a matter of their national sovereignty. And not only has President Diaz-Canel himself said that, but every Cuban senior official who has spoken on this topic has underscored that position. So if the U.S. is going to demand a change in Cuba's leaders, these negotiations are going to fail. But if the United States would be willing to settle for a deal in which the economic relationship between Cuba and the United States was fundamentally transformed in a way that benefits both countries, that's a deal that could be had.
Definitely, it's very interesting and important to understand the contradictions and the divides that exist between the Cubans in the diaspora and what's happening inside the island. Because even if Diaz-Canel doesn't have or wouldn't have as much support, there seems to be a widespread rejection of U.S. intervention inside the island, despite the discontent and despite the protests. Of course, sometimes it feels like we are traveling in time, because on one side, like you were saying, back to the 50s, we are hearing Trump saying it would be an honor to take Cuba, and Diaz-Canel saying that he wants to sacrifice his life for the revolution. So in both sides, there is a sort of reproduction of the 20th century, at least to me. But there's but this, in regards to this complex, like to this divide between the diaspora, and you brought up Marco Rubio, who is a direct result of this diaspora, and a representative of the anti-Castro exile community in Florida. I'm sure if he's second generation, but I think he's second generation. And at the same time, we have to recognize the critical role of these remittances. Like I was talking to a Cuban friend, and he was saying that in Cuba, there's this saying or question that when you ask people, do you have faith? In Spanish, ¿tú tienes fe? And fe means familiar en el extranjero, no? Familia abroad, no? And so it's clear that the remittances are from family members abroad are super important to sustain the livelihood of Cubans. So what would be the role of the diaspora actually as a political actor? Of course, Marco Rubio is being a diaspora political actor very clearly as well. So how are they actually, what is their actual power in determining the political future of the island? And also, when going also back to what we were saying earlier, that countries like Mexico, Algeria, Angola, and Venezuela are no longer supplying oil. What are the allies that Cuba has left? You mentioned Russia, and I'm wondering if China. I'm wondering if there is a progressive Latin American left on the rise that may also be an ally. I don't know. I've asked you many things in this last question, but
well, let me start with the issue of Cuba's allies. Russia is probably right now the most steadfast of those allies, although China has been providing Cuba with large numbers of solar panels and the basic equipment to make a transition from oil-based electrical power to solar-based electrical power. Just last year, Cuba tripled its solar energy, went from 3% of consumption to 10%, so it's still a small part, but they hope to double that again this year to 20%, and then it begins to relieve some of the pressure that they're feeling for the shortage of petroleum that they're facing. So China, of course, is a net importer of oil, so they're not providing oil to Cuba. And right now, with the Strait of Hormuz closed, China itself is finding itself facing shortages of petroleum.
Hmm.
Cuba has friends in Latin America, of course, Brazil and Mexico, probably the most prominent right now, but they're rhetorical friends in the sense that they're critical of U.S. policy towards Cuba, but they haven't really devoted resources of their own to relieving the pressure on Cuba, except for some humanitarian assistance. Mexico has sent humanitarian assistance, but not petroleum. Mexico had been sending oil, and in fact, last year they sent almost as much as Venezuela did, because Venezuela's contribution was declining as a result of the declining production of oil in Venezuela because of the problems there in the oil industry. But when Trump declared this oil embargo, Mexico stopped shipping oil. And the reason is that Mexico right now is engaged with the United States in the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And that's absolutely essential to the Mexican economy. And so President Sheinbaum can't take the risk of sabotaging those negotiations by offending President Trump sending oil to Cuba. So, at least for the time being, it appears that Mexico is not going to join Russia in helping to supply oil to Cuba. With regard to the Cuban diaspora, we're in an interesting moment in the history of the Cuban diaspora. Since the 1980s, I would say they had a lot of influence over U.S. policy towards Cuba. They're strategically centered in Florida, which is traditionally an important state in U.S. presidential elections. They are very focused on the issue of Cuba, so they're probably the only constituency in the United States that will vote for president based on the candidate's position on Cuba. So that gives them a lot of political influence. I would say, though, it's been declining in recent years because the community is divided. There are people in the community who supported President Obama's opening on the island. And in fact, it was a majority by the end of the Obama administration. Now it's swung back again to a majority in favor of the embargo, which tells us that Cuban Americans, like everybody, tend to follow the lead of their president. If their president says, we're going to be friends now with Cuba, oh, then Cuba is, seen more favorably. If the president says Cuba is a national security threat to the United States, then people say, oh, well, Cuba must be a bad place. The most vocal Cuban Americans today in favor of a very tough, hard line are the elected members of Congress coming from South Florida. There are three of them in particular in the House of Representatives who've actually been demanding that the Trump administration take even tougher measures than the administration has been willing to take. And I think that's interesting. The administration has not followed their lead, even though Marco Rubio is Secretary of State. The other thing that's interesting is that the Trump administration has stripped Cuban Americans of the privileges they previously enjoyed as immigrants to the United States. It used to be that the United States never turned away a Cuban coming to the United States. Then, of course, for a time, there was the wet foot, dry foot policy, where if you were picked up by the Coast Guard at sea trying to get to Florida, you were sent back to Cuba. But if you came to the southern border of the United States, you were simply admitted and were able to adjust your status after a year and get on a path to citizenship. The Trump administration has halted all of that and begun to deport Cubans who are here undocumented to Cuba and even to third countries like Mexico. And that has caused a great uproar in the Cuban American community, which feels like the Trump administration hated them.
Definitely, and I was thinking of the Mariel boat lift when you were speaking, and I guess when that happened, it was still a moment in which Cubans had that I don't know if it was exactly a refugee status, um, but most definitely it has things are very very different now, and they are also different to like because I've been trying to make this parallel with when the Soviet Union fell, no, and like 1989, um, and so the tools that Cuba has now are different, and like you say, there is this hope of renewable energy, and I was personally surprised when I heard Diaz-Canel. He was granting an interview to a Spanish media outlet, and recently when the humanitarian convoy Nuestra America went there last month, and he spoke of the concept of energy sovereignty, and I think that and I don't know if now the tools are different. There is no there are no like that sense of people trying to flee Cuba like they were fleeing Cuba in the 90s. I'm unsure if that's the situation now, because the travel ban is still not like it's still like what Obama did. Like the travel ban is not exactly on working right now. Like people can travel, but like, or at least that's what I think, that there is more freedom of movement. But maybe you can correct me if that's not true. But I guess what I want to get to is that I guess we don't have there is some uncertainty, but there is also new things that may make Cuba stronger now than before. And I am unsure if this is idealistic, this idea of the energy sovereignty. It was through solar panels. Like you were saying, there's also I also heard Diaz-Canel talk about the sugar cane industry and transforming the sugar fields to produce biomass, and then again, he, of course, as Diaz-Canel, and he's still a product of the regime, and he was saying that he was, of course, talking about the good side of things, no? And he was saying, defending the scientific feats that they have, that Cuba has has had in the recent years, like creating 5 COVID vaccines. And so definitely there are things that are working inside Cuba, but others that are definitely not working at all. No? And of course, technology is still not democratized. Access to the internet is not that easy. Still, I mean, it's easier each time, but it's not. But it's still controlled. Food distribution, of course. Now this strange hybrid between the private sector, the informal private sector, that is so prevalent, and of course Cubans seem to be able to get by, but I don't know. I don't know what to do myself with this paradox, with the Cuban paradox of how is it that they are actually they always resist, and they resist creatively, like Diaz-Canel also said, and there is definitely a richness in natural resources to be used, but how can we reconcile all of this?
So I think the references to energy sovereignty are aspirational. Let me put it that way, right? I mean, today Cuba has no energy sovereignty. It is dependent on imported energy, and Cuba now is learning what that means in very concrete terms, because it is only able to have about half the energy that it normally uses. And as a result of that, the entire economy is in crisis. And, we've seen a lot of reporting about that, about how hospitals can't operate on people because they don't have reliable electricity. They don't have fuel for their generators, even when the central system goes down. Public transportation is really now at just a minimum. There is no travel really from one province to another, no long distance travel for the lack of gasoline. Farmers can't get their produce to market because they have no gasoline for their trucks. Factories are shut down 2 days a week because there's no reliable electricity, and so on and so on. It's an economy that's being gradually brought to a halt by this shortage of energy. I think the renewables are obviously the way for Cuba to go, since they don't have a lot of domestic petroleum. They produce about 40% of their own petroleum use. They have to import the rest. So renewables in the form of solar is sort of obvious. And today in Cuba are criticizing the government for not having done this sooner, for not having invested in a transition to solar sooner. The sugar industry in Cuba is in disarray at this point. Last year, Cuba had to import sugar. That's how bad the production was. What Cuba needs is an outside capital, presumably from a foreign investor, in combination with domestic investment, to essentially rebuild the sugar industry. There's roughly a third of arable land in Cuba today is not being produced. It used to be sugar land, but when they closed down some of the older sugar mills that were not operating efficiently, there were no farmers to come and start producing on that land. Cuba's a 70% urban country. It's not a rural country by any means. And so, but one can imagine, because sugar is an agro industry after all, one can imagine investors coming in and partnering with the Cuban government to rehabilitate the sugar industry and then produce energy as well as sugar itself, both for domestic consumption and for export. And it could once again be an important part of the Cuban economy. Cuba has made some incredible advances in the biopharma sector of their economy. They've been severely constrained by the U.S. embargo in being able to actually monetize that internationally. But Cuba's in desperate situation today and extremely vulnerable to the United States, which is, I think, precisely why you're seeing the United States on the offensive right now to try to change the Cuban system.
Definitely, there's been like this sequence of Greenland, Venezuela, then but each country has its own history, and each country has, like, for example, like this current discourse around Iran as as having underestimated the situation there, thinking that it would be similar to what happened with Maduro in Venezuela. But even Venezuela and Cuba being similar in a way, but they are so different. And Cuba's decade, like, how many decades are we talking about? Starting in 1959, the regime is so ingrained into Cuba, and there's, when we hear Diaz-Canel and Trump speak, like, has there been, or are you aware of any actual diplomacy? Like, I mean, I can imagine Marco Rubio is the forefront of this, of any diplomatic enterprise with Cuba, but is it going to be more like, I mean, anything that, how do you think, if Cuba has no other way out, if Cuba is bound or has to negotiate with the US inevitably? Like, can this happen in equal terms? Because of course Iran
So
had the Strait of Hormuz, but
yeah,
Cuba, what does Cuba have?
yeah. Venezuela has oil, of course, right? So
And Venezuela
yeah,
has
no, I
oil,
mean,
so
yeah. So I mean, those are big advantages, obviously. No, so we know
obviously,
there
yeah.
there is a dialogue. There is a dialogue underway between Cuba and the United States. It started out as a back channel secret exchange of ideas, and then Donald Trump started talking about it to the press, and so it wasn't secret anymore. Both sides now have acknowledged, yes, there have been some meetings. Two meetings that we know of that were face-to-face meetings with U.S. officials and Cuban officials. One at the time of the CARICOM summit in St. Kitts, and another just on April 10th in Havana, where a whole team of U.S. negotiators from the Department of State went to Havana to meet with a team from the Cuban Foreign Ministry. Most of the issues that we know are on the U.S. agenda are economic issues, but there are some political ones as well, like freeing political prisoners and creating a more open political system, a process of political change, which is sort of left vague in what we know about it. Um, so it's difficult. It's difficult to know, when the two sides get down to the specifics of what they might agree to. Sort of a vague promise of political change is not going to be sufficient, obviously. But as I said, if they can stick to the economic issues, which are more defined, more well defined, and are things that Cuba has said it is willing to discuss with the United States to try to find agreement, then the prospect for progress is potentially good. But Cuba doesn't have many
Yes.
alternatives, but I will say, the United States doesn't have many alternatives in this either. It appears the United States, of course, is just overwhelmingly powerful economically and militarily, and that's absolutely true. But when you start to think about it, the United States is learning in Iran that you can't change a regime by bombing them from the air. That just doesn't work. And even if you kill off their top leaders, there are new leaders that succeed, and you still face the same regime. I don't believe that the United States is going to invade and occupy Cuba. First, because there are already cracks in Donald Trump's political base because of Iran. The America First segment of MAGA is really unhappy with this new foreign war we're getting involved in. And I think to actually put boots on the ground in Cuba would just exacerbate that enormously. Second, if the United States occupies Cuba, it immediately becomes responsible for the welfare of 10 million Cubans who don't have enough medicine today, don't have enough food today, don't have enough energy to keep the lights on. And the United States suddenly has to take on the burden of providing all of those services to 10 million people. And I don't think this administration is going to be prepared to do that. And the third reason is that, the Cuban Armed Forces has been training for U.S. invasion since at least 1980, when Ronald Reagan threatened an invasion of the island. And their military doctrine is not to try to defend the cities or try to defend the airports or the seaports. Their military doctrine, which they call the War of the Whole People, is for the armed forces to melt into the population and wage a long-term asymmetric guerrilla war against an occupying force, which is what the Iraqis did in Iraq. So the military prospect of an invasion of Cuba, yes, it would be very easy to get in there and take over the island. It would not be easy to hold it.
That's a very important point. And considering the growing unpopularity, the midterms coming ahead, the economic disaster that the war on Iran has caused, like it makes that is a lot of sense to see this as well in economical terms and to think about the investment that this would be for the US, and that maybe that could be a deterrent in the sense of not being able to ever leave. No? However, sorry.
No, I was just going to say. So if you sort of think through the options available to the United States, if just bombing them is not going to change anything, and an occupation is just too risky and dangerous politically, economically, militarily, then the only option for the United States to get something that it wants from the situation is to sit down at the negotiating table with the Cuban government and see what the two sides can agree to. I mean, there is the alternative, of course, that the negotiations fail and the Trump administration just continues to try to strangle the Cuban economy. But the risk to the United States there is that the economy collapses and Cubans begin to get on rafts and come to the United States again, like they did in 1994, and that Cuban Americans get in boats and go south to rescue their friends and family, like they did in 1980. And you have a huge migration crisis, which again is the last thing that this administration would want to see.
Of course, they don't want a migration crisis for sure. And in this also the other sort of a strategy that was mentioned when talking about the plan of overthrowing governments such as Venezuela or Iran was this idea that the people inside the country, in this case the people inside Cuba, are so fed up with the government that they are going to insurrect and they are going to throw out the government, and thinking about the revolution coming from within, you know? Or well, maybe not the revolution is not the most the best word for this, but the insurrection to the revolution coming from within. So I'm and here and I can bring us to my last prepared question, which was it also caught my eye, your contribution to the Contemporary Cuban Reader was back in 2007 when you were analyzing the generational shift that Fidel Castro's death meant, and how I think you were formulating that Raúl Castro represented some sort of reinvention of the revolution, and that he also had some economic ideas that were different to Fidel's. No, and he had. I can't pinpoint exactly to how you described this difference in economic policy between Fidel and Raúl, but bringing this to now Díaz-Canel, and to me, one of the elements that I think is relevant, maybe it's not as relevant as I think it is social media. And how the generational shift today is also very much defined by, despite the government, the state control of the internet, now new generations have other access, have other networks, other possibilities of creating discourse and possible insurrection. So, like maybe adding Díaz-Canel to this idea of the generational change and where are we at now, and thinking of the change that could come from within Cuba. And I wanted to ask you, like, how do you feel about the revolution still being reinvented, or is it at its limit? Like, has it reached its limit, or is it still being reinvented?
So there are a lot of facets to that. There's the generational change in the Cuban population, which is a very important political factor. Because if you look at what little opinion polls we have in Cuba, you see a really sharp divide between older people who remember the the Batista regime, years of the revolution when there was sort of almost universal support for the revolution, and even into the 1970s, which was a fairly prosperous time in Cuba economically in relative terms. Those people still have strong support for the government, not a majority, but a very strong minority in the 40% range. But if you look at people born later whose lived experience of the revolution is the austerity of the special period and the economic crises that have followed that, they are much more disenchanted with the revolution and with the government that they blame for these economic policies. So there's this generational divide on the island. But it doesn't manifest itself, and I don't believe will manifest itself in some kind of uprising against the government because there's no organized opposition. The government has been very effective at suppressing any kind of organized opposition, and most of the people who have tried to organize something have left the island and gone into exile. And of course, this is sort of the classic pattern in Cuba, is that opponents of the government don't stay, and for the most part, there are exceptions, of course, but a lot of them sort of give up because it seems so futile, and they go into exile instead, either to Miami or to Madrid. So the government doesn't really face a significant internal threat to its control, which is not to say that people are happy. There is very widespread discontent on the island because of the economic situation. I think, people understand that part of it is the result of the embargo, and the government reminds them daily of that, of course. But people also believe, and I think with cause, that a large part of the current crisis is also the result of failed policies on the part of the Cuban government. Their failure to diversify the economy and put all their eggs in the one basket of tourism, their failed effort to unify the currency and exchange rates in 2021 that unleashed hyperinflation, their very, very, very slow implementation of the economic reforms that Raul Castro tried to start in 2011. And he clearly had very different ideas about economic policy than Fidel. Fidel was very much against any kind of the use of market mechanisms or what he called capitalist methods in the Cuban economy. And he said in one of his last speeches before he fell ill that you can never create socialism using capitalist methods. Whereas Raul, on the other hand, has been much more pragmatic in his approach to economics. His approach reminds me of Deng Xiaoping when he was asked, well, aren't the Chinese economic reforms, restoring capitalism? And he said, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. That is to say, you need to have an economy that is productive and provides for people's basic needs. It was Raul famously who said during the special period, when Fidel was resisting the use of market reforms to restart the economy in the special period, it was Raul who said, beans are more important than cannons, which is to say that the shortage of food that they were experiencing was in itself a national security threat that they had to address by any means necessary. So in 2011, Raul introduces what they called the updating of the Cuban economy, but it was essentially a program for transition from a centrally planned economy that they inherited from the Soviet Union to more of a Vietnamese-style market socialism. But the problem is that it ran into bureaucratic resistance from stakeholders who stood to lose if the economy was changed in that way. And the result is that a lot of those reforms, they still haven't implemented now, more than 15 years later.
That's incredible. And and also thinking it's a sense of installment with what the things that start initiated with Obama, circling back to the Obama era. I remember hearing at the time that there was they were saying, I remember I was living in Spain at the time, and people saying that they were going to invest, like Spanish TV, televisions or production companies were at last going to start investing, and private television was going to be in Cuba, and and all of this, and certain conversations that I'm sure happened at the time, but that, like you say, maybe now are starting to be retaken, but there's been it's been so slow, or maybe even paralyzed.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a number of reasons for that, right? So when the normalization happened during the Obama period, U.S. business people in particular were just really eager to get into Cuba, and hundreds of them, literally hundreds of them, went down there to talk with the Ministry of Foreign Investment and Trade and see if they could strike a deal. And several dozen companies did actually, sign contracts with Cuba, mostly in telecommunications, and in hospitality sector, cruise ships, airlines, that sort of thing. But a lot of the business people, they got down to Cuba and they looked around and they said, well, the infrastructure here is not in good repair. The government regulations around private investment are like a maze to try to get through them. We make a proposal and we don't get a response from the ministry. And so maybe it's early for us to invest in Cuba. Maybe we have to wait a little bit until the government matures in its relationship with foreign investors, and until the infrastructure gets a little bit better, and so on. And I think the same is probably true of European investors who were not looking at Cuba previously because of the hostile relationship between the United States and Cuba. They didn't want to get in the middle of that. Started to look at Cuba during the Obama period, and they found the same thing that U.S. investors were finding, that in fact it was not going to be an easy place to do business, and you needed to be a kind of a risk taker as an investor to try to get into Cuba early and hope that as sort of the first mover, you would get a first mover economic advantage on the island. And a number of companies did that, but not at the scale that Cuba needs foreign investment and needs infusions of external capital in order to really restart the economy.
See, yes. So let's and now with the I mention all the time the Cold War, but it's like I have this. I know that we are no longer in the 20th century, but there's also this view of how the Cold War never ended, and we are at least there are still remnants of those divides, and it's true that maybe this allyship with Russia that is now still showing important for Cuba is not helping Cuba right now, but what can they do if there are not so many options of allyship? And me, I'm personally I study Latin America. I'm half Peruvian and have Spanish, but I've always been very deeply connected emotionally to Cuban literature, and I remember, I don't know if you've read the book, the autobiography of Reinaldo Arenas, the Before Night Falls, but you know of him. He was or maybe you've heard of him. I don't know, but he fled with the Mariel because he was homosexual, and there's this, and to me as a left wing leaning European that grew up outside the US, because in the US, and I see it with my students, the general discourse around Cuba is very different to the general discourse around Cuba in Europe. there's more of a romanticization, or there's more space for romanticization in Europe, no? And when I read this this book, and he was explaining how he was discriminated upon for being gay in Cuba, then, and not only that, no, like reading in first person, like many of things opened my eyes, but that, and the reality of and when I went there to Cuba for the first time and I saw the issue with prostitution, I was able to go for the first time in 2018, when after the travel ban, when there were started to be direct flights between Miami and La Habana. And I mean, it's always a bittersweet feeling, because I know I just I mean, I don't know, I'm going in a tangent, I'm so sorry, but I just want to say how difficult it is to reconcile the mixed feelings, because, at least to me, because I think that there are some things that are for sure valuable of the Cuban example, but you can't, in Spanish we say, no puedes defender lo indefendible, no? Like, you can't defend the
yes, you can't defend the indefensible, no. same in English. It's the same in English.
So anyway, I just told you a little bit of how I feel, but I will cut it off. But I just want to hear your final remarks.
So I think it's important to keep in mind at this moment, when the two governments are engaged in high politics, as we call it, right? I mean, the leaders negotiating with one another, moving for position, arguing, trying to get public opinion on their side. I think it's important not to forget that it's regular people, it's ordinary Cubans who are the ones that are paying the price for all of this, right? It's not Diaz-Canel who can't find food, right? It's ordinary Cubans who can't live their lives in a normal, sensible way, because they can't get a bus to go to work, because the factory's closed, because they can't find food in the store, because they go to the hospital and there's no medicine. They need an operation. Well, the hospital can't do it because they can't guarantee the electricity. I mean, this is what Cubans all across the island are suffering on a daily basis as a result of this current increase and escalation of tensions. And the idea of imposing an oil blockade on a country to strangle its economy is a classic example of collective punishment of an entire population. And it's not consistent with international law. And the current United States government has made it clear that it doesn't feel bound by international norms or international law, that it is conducting a foreign policy, as Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff, said explicitly, that is based on the fact that the United States is more powerful than other countries, and therefore we're going to do what we want.
Yeah, it's like the menace of deterrence, but the good news is that they are not so good at a strategy, it seems. So let's hope that the best for Cuba. They deserve it. Cubans deserve it. It's such a I don't know, an intelligent, beautiful population that they deserve it. And I really appreciate. Thank you, and I really appreciate all of your that you shared all your knowledge with us, because when it comes to countries that, only to say that.
My pleasure to be able to join you today.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.